The train is slowing down. It is not supposed to be slowing down. Not here. Not at this particular stretch of track 40 miles from the nearest town in open country at 10 o'clock at night. The engineer knows it. The fireman knows it. The express car messenger sitting behind a reinforced door in the middle of the train has been told exactly what to do if this happens. And right now, he is doing the one thing that tells you how serious the situation already is. He is checking his shotgun. Out in the dark, somewhere past the reach of the locomotive headlamp, there are riders. They have been waiting for hours. They know the schedule because someone told them, because they studied the company timetable, because they watched this same train roll through this same stretch 2 or 3 weeks ago and timed how long it took to brake from a full head of steam on a rising grade. They have spare horses tied in the tree line. They have a rough plan for what happens next, and they have almost no plan at all for what happens 40 minutes after that. That gap, the space between stopping the train and getting clean away, is where the whole thing usually fell apart. Not in the movies. In the movies, the gang rides off into the dark, and the law never catches them until the final reel. But the real story is different. The real story is about schedules and telegraph wires and professional detective agencies and reward money and informants and tired horses and the slow mechanical weight of a system that was being purpose-built in real time. Not to close the distance between an outlaw and a jail cell. The movies gave us the train robbery as an act of frontier freedom. The cowboy outlaw, fast on his horse, smart enough to beat the railroad, too quick for the law, riding off with a bag of gold. Jesse James, Butch Cassidy, Black Bart. The names carry a certain weight, even now, because the story got told so many times it started to feel true. But what the popular version almost never shows you is the preparation required to stop a moving train without getting killed by it, the specialized knowledge needed to crack a hardened express car safe, the precise timing required before the telegraph turned the entire landscape hostile, and the uncomfortable fact that most men who tried this died, died in prison, or died somewhere in the territory with a reward notice describing their face posted at every railroad station within 300 miles. The train robbery was not just a crime. It was a logistics problem, and the logistics of getting away were significantly harder than the logistics of getting on. To understand why, you have to understand what a train actually was in the American West between roughly 1865 and 1900. It was not just transportation. It was the arterial system of a continent that was still being organized. The railroad carried payroll from mines, silver and gold bullion from western deposits to eastern banks, paper currency from federal mints to frontier businesses, cattle sale proceeds, and the daily cash receipts of dozens of commerce towns that had no other reliable way to move money across the open range. Trains ran on published schedules that anyone could pick up from a station agent for almost nothing. They traveled fixed routes through fixed terrain. They stopped at fixed points, and they carried the same type of specialized freight car on more or less every run. A reinforced car managed by Adams Express, Wells Fargo, or one of several other express firms handling high-value shipments under contract. If you knew what was moving and when, you knew where to be. That knowledge was the beginning of everything. Every serious train robbery that historians can reconstruct from court records, railroad company reports, Pinkerton agency files, and contemporary newspaper accounts started not with guns but with information. The kind of information that had to come from somewhere specific. Someone working at a bank who knew a large shipment was scheduled. A station agent who mentioned the wrong detail to the wrong person in a saloon. A former railroad survey hand who knew the terrain well enough to identify a grade where a locomotive would slow naturally. A woman working at a boarding house where railroad officials stayed when they passed through town. The pattern shows up clearly once you start reading the actual records rather than the mythology. Robberies that succeeded in taking significant cash almost always had a thread of inside information somewhere near the start. The Reno brothers were moving on express cars in Indiana as early as 1866, and even that early the pattern was recognizable. Knowledge of a route, a plan for stopping the train, a plan for the car, and an escape lined out in advance. The mechanics got more sophisticated as the years went on and as the railroad companies hardened their operations, but the fundamental problem stayed identical. You needed information before you could do anything else. After information came scouting, and this part almost never makes it into the popular version because it does not look dramatic. It looks patient. It looks like 2 or 3 men riding slowly through broken country, taking notes in their heads, counting the distance between water sources, checking how long it took to ride from a particular bend in the tracks to the nearest town where a telegraph office sat. But it was essential work, because the escape route had to be mapped out in detail before the robbery happened. Not during it, and not after. Once that train stopped and the shooting started, time compressed hard. Every minute spent on that train was a minute the telegraph was building a response against you. The scouting was where you bought yourself the only real margin you had. A good stopping location had specific requirements. The grade needed to be enough to slow the locomotive before the crew could make a decision about whether to comply or try to push through. The darkness and the distance from the nearest town needed to be enough to give the gang a head start before anyone could ride for help. The terrain had to make a mounted escape viable and ideally had to complicate pursuit, broken ground, river crossings, canyon country, timber. Something that slowed horses ridden by men who did not know the land as well as the men who had ridden it twice already in the preparation weeks. And the location needed to sit far enough from a telegraph station that the alarm message could not hit the wire before the gang was already deep into its exit. This is the part that most popular accounts get wrong. The telegraph was not an afterthought. It was the single most dangerous tool the railroads and the law had against robbery gangs, and the men who understood the problem seriously knew it from the start. The Wild Bunch, operating across Utah and Wyoming and into the surrounding territories in the 1890s and early 1900s, selected robbery sites with obvious attention to the location of telegraph stations and the geography between those stations and the nearest law. The hole-in-the-wall country in Wyoming was not just a hideout. It was a geographic buffer between the gang and the nearest points where a telegraph message could generate organized pursuit. Distance was the product they were buying with every piece of careful preparation, and distance was exactly what the railroads were spending serious money to eliminate. By the mid-1880s, the major railroads had built telegraph lines running parallel to most of their main routes. The primary reason was operational: scheduling trains, relaying instructions between stations, coordinating maintenance, managing the enormous logistical complexity of running trains across hundreds of miles of territory without modern communications. But the same infrastructure that coordinated railroad operations could transmit a robbery report in under a minute. A message describing the robbery location, the number of men, the direction of flight, and any identifying details the train crew had collected could be on the wire before the dust the gang raised had settled. That message could reach every station, every county seat, every railroad detective on the network faster than any horse alive. The gang that stopped the train had maybe 20 minutes before that network started generating a coordinated response, sometimes less. The express car itself was the immediate problem, and it was a harder problem than most accounts make it sound. Wells Fargo and the other express companies had been running valuable shipments since the stagecoach era, and they had learned from decades of robbery attempts. By the time the train robbery era hit its stride in the 1870s and 1880s, a serious express car was a hardened piece of equipment. The walls were reinforced. The safe was a heavy iron or steel box bolted to the floor, built by manufacturers who understood perfectly well that someone was going to try to open it under pressure. The messenger, the Wells Fargo or Adams Express agent riding in the car, was armed, trained, and operating under specific instructions about what to do when the train stopped unexpectedly in open country. Those instructions generally said to keep the door locked, keep the safe locked, and hold position. The express companies had calculated, correctly, that a gang capable of stopping a train was almost certainly capable of killing one man with a shotgun, but that a locked reinforced car bought time and raised the cost of the attack enough to discourage the casual operator. It did not discourage the serious ones, but it did mean that a successful robbery required either forcing the messenger out or forcing the door, and doing either while the clock was running toward the telegraph. Response took nerve and preparation that a lot of would-be train robbers simply did not have. The tools evolved quickly. Black powder and later dynamite were used to blow express car doors and safes. The James Younger gang, the Daltons, the Wild Bunch, and others all worked through their own versions of this problem. Dynamite was effective but unpredictable when the goal was to open a safe without destroying the contents. One account from an 1894 robbery attempt describes a gang blowing a safe so completely that the paper currency inside was reduced to fragments worth nothing to anyone. The coin and the gold survived. The paper did not. Getting the charge right was a skill that most outlaws learned through expensive mistakes. Beyond the safe, there were passengers to manage. The passenger cars held ordinary people, some of them armed, most of them frightened, and any one of them might have a pistol and enough poor judgment to use it. Keeping several dozen passengers subdued and calm, while 2 or 3 men worked on a reinforced safe in the next car, required enough manpower that the gang had to split its attention constantly between breaking into the car and keeping everyone from making a bad decision. Most accounts show gangs using visible firepower and deliberate verbal authority, moving through the cars quickly, making clear that compliance was the only sensible choice, and not lingering long enough to give anyone a window to act. The passengers were also witnesses. Every face seen, every name shouted by a gang member to another, every distinguishing detail observed inside those cars became a description that went onto the telegraph wire as soon as the train reached the next station. Witness accounts were often imprecise and sometimes contradictory, but they were the raw material that detective agencies and sheriffs worked from, and even rough descriptions started narrowing the field. Here is where the reality of the outlaw situation starts to look genuinely difficult rather than romantic. Once the robbery was done and the gang rode into the dark, they were not free. They were inside a problem that was getting harder with every passing minute. The horses matter more than almost anything else in the escape, and this is something the popular version handles carelessly. A horse that has been tied standing in a cold draw for 2 hours, then ridden hard for 20 miles, and then asked to carry a grown man plus a share of the take across rough, broken country at speed is not an inexhaustible machine. Horses tire, they go lame, they lose their footing on bad ground in the dark. A gang moving fast through unfamiliar territory at night was always one bad step away from having a man on foot in the open, and a man on foot in open country after a train robbery was essentially a man in custody waiting for the paperwork. The better gangs used relay horses. They positioned spare mounts at intervals along the escape route, tied out in prearranged locations where a rider could swap a blown horse for a fresh one and keep moving. This required the same kind of advance work as scouting the robbery site. Somebody had to ride the escape route, pick the relay points, secure the horses, keep them watered and fed, and make sure they were still there on the night of the robbery. That was time, money, and exposure. Because every person involved in the preparation was a person who knew enough to testify against you if something went wrong. And things went wrong with remarkable regularity. The Posses that formed after a train robbery were not always the Hollywood version, a loose group of ranchers riding in confused circles until the outlaws slipped away clean. Some Posses were exactly that. County sheriffs had limited budgets, limited jurisdiction, and limited experience with organized pursuit across open terrain. But the railroad companies had money, and they spent it on something more effective than local posses. Wells Fargo maintained a detective operation that had been running since the stagecoach days. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency had been working railroad cases since 1855. Hired initially by the railroads themselves to handle this exact category of problem, by the time train robberies were a serious pattern in the West, there were professional men whose entire job was finding outlaws, and those men worked differently from a county sheriff with a badge and a horse. The Pinkerton model was not primarily about immediate pursuit. It was about intelligence. The agency built files. They collected physical descriptions, tracked known associates, followed money, developed informants inside outlaw communities, and assembled a systematic picture of a criminal's habits and connections that a county sheriff operating from one town simply could not construct. When a Pinkerton operative started working a case, the target often did not know it for weeks or months. The agency was patient in a way that individual pursuit could not be, sustaining investigations across state lines and across years in a way that no single local jurisdiction could match. The railroads paid well for this service because the alternative was expensive. A single successful robbery of a major express shipment could cost a railroad company tens of thousands of dollars in a single night. The Adams Express Company and Wells Fargo calculated the cost of detective work, reward money, and pursuit against the cost of accepting repeated losses, and they spent accordingly. The reward posters that went up after major robberies were not symbolic gestures. They were financial instruments, converting the loyalty of everyone in the territory into a potential informant by making betrayal economically rational. $2,500 was a serious amount of money in 1885. For a cowboy making $25 a month on a cattle drive, that represented 8.5 years of wages. For a ranch hand, a store clerk, a station employee, or anyone else operating close to the economic edge of the frontier, it was the kind of money that could change a life. The reward system essentially priced outlaw silence out of the market in communities where most people were already stretched thin. You could be loyal to the gang, or you could be secure for a decade. When it came to that actual choice in practice, a significant number of people chose security. This is the uncomfortable arithmetic behind the romantic outlaw story. The gang needed people. Every person it needed was a person who could be turned. The horses had to come from somewhere, which meant a seller who had seen the men buying them. The food and shelter during preparation had to come from somewhere, which meant a household that had seen the faces. The inside information that made the robbery possible had to come from someone connected enough to railroad operations to be found and interviewed under pressure. The network of needs that made a train robbery possible was the same network that made a train robber findable. The gangs that lasted understood this. The ones that did not think about it got caught by it. Jesse James understood this in practice, even if the historical record does not show him articulating the theory. His gang spent years operating through a specific geography in Missouri and the surrounding states. And they survived as long as they did, partly because of genuine community sympathy in their home region, and partly because they were careful about who they trusted and how they moved. The story of the Ford brothers and what happened in 1882 is what happens when that network collapses from the inside. Robert Ford was inside the circle. He had been trusted enough to be present when the defenses were down. The reward money and the promise of immunity did the rest. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid represent the other side of the same calculation. The Pinkerton files on Cassidy, which survive in the agency's archive and have been examined by serious historians, show a methodical accumulation of intelligence that eventually made the United States too small to operate in safely. Not too physically dangerous in terms of immediate pursuit, but too known. The systematic tracking of associates, the informant network woven through the territories, the coordination between railroad detectives across state lines, all of it added up to a situation where Cassidy apparently concluded that the margin of operating safely had closed permanently. The move to South America in 1901 was not romantic wandering. It was a practical response to an environment that had stopped allowing for mistakes. The telegraph network accelerated all of this faster than the outlaws could adapt. Before reliable telegraph coverage, a gang with a clean initial escape had real hours before organized response was possible. By the mid-1880s, that window had shrunk to minutes. A message confirming a robbery location could move from the scene to every major town on the network in under 10 minutes. Sheriffs in multiple counties could be alerted before the gang had covered 15 miles. A railroad detective in the nearest city could be on a train heading toward the robbery site within hours. The system was not perfect, County boundaries caused coordination problems and witnesses were sometimes wrong, but the direction was always clear. Every decade, the net got tighter and the window between robbery and organized response got shorter. The express car safe was the goal, but not every train was worth stopping in the way the popular story suggests. The value of a given shipment depended on timing, on what business was moving money along a particular route. 2. On whether a mining payroll or a cattle payment happened to coincide with the departure date. The gangs with reliable inside information tried to time their operations accordingly. The ones working from rumor often stopped trains carrying relatively modest cash that did not cover the cost of the preparation, the risk, and the share divided among however many men participated. The historical record makes this surprisingly clear when you look at specific cases. The express companies had learned to vary the schedules on high-value transfers in ways that made advance intelligence harder to confirm. What remained available to a gang stopping a regular run was often ordinary business cash. Real money, certainly, but split among 6 or 8 men after paying out the preparation costs, it could be significantly lower than the legend implies. The most famous robberies, the ones that generated the newspaper coverage and built the mythology, were the exceptions, and they were often the exceptions that exposed the limits of the operation most clearly. The Northfield, Minnesota raid in 1876 was a bank operation rather than a train job, but it illustrates the same point. The big, ambitious operation that looks like proof of outlaw capability is sometimes actually the moment where the system reveals its real ceiling. Northfield cost the James Younger gang most of its operational core. The 3 younger brothers were captured. 2 other gang members were killed. Jesse and Frank James escaped, but into a period of reduced activity that the gang never recovered from. The railroad companies and express firms were learning and adapting at the same time. After the first serious wave of train robberies in the 1870s, they made specific operational changes. Express car safes were upgraded on a regular improvement schedule. Messengers were better armed and given cleaner procedures. Some routes began carrying additional armed guards in positions that made forced entry more costly. The practice of moving the most valuable cargo on schedules that did not match the publicly associated departure times developed as a deliberate countermeasure. The express companies began varying the routing of high-value transfers in ways designed to defeat advance intelligence. None of this made train robbery impossible. The Wild Bunch was stopping trains successfully in the late 1890s after all of these countermeasures were well established. But the cost of doing it right kept rising. The preparation had to be more thorough, the scouting more careful, the relay horses better positioned and better maintained, the inside information more confirmed before the operation launched. The margin for error kept compressing. And the consequences of being caught, as the federal court system extended its reach across the territories through the 1880s and 90s, kept getting heavier. You have to think about what it actually meant to live inside that system from the outlaw side of it. Not the movie version, the practical daily reality. You are living rough for weeks during the preparation phase because you cannot afford to be visible in towns where faces get remembered and described. You are spending money you have not yet made on horses and supplies and information that may or may not turn out to be accurate when you need it most. The night comes, the train slows, and everything your preparation has built toward is concentrated into the next 20 or 30 minutes. You get through the car. You get into the safe. You get out with what there is to get. And then, you are riding in the dark across ground you have practiced, but never ridden in exactly these conditions, on horses that have been standing in a draw for 2 hours, with the absolute certainty that somewhere behind you, a message is already moving on the wire. The posse might be slow. The sheriff might be incompetent. The telegraph operator at the next station might have stepped away from his post. You might get lucky. Some gangs did get lucky more than once. But luck is not a system, and the men who understood this problem clearly knew that luck had a shelf life. The longer you operated, the more the environment accumulated knowledge about you. More people had seen your face. More station agents and ranch owners had been shown your description. The Pinkerton files got thicker. The reward posters spread wider. Moving to a new territory meant starting the exposure process over in a place where you did not know the land and did not have the local connections that had kept you operational before. The James Gang's durability in Missouri was inseparable from the specific social and political environment of that region in the years after the Civil War. Former Confederate guerrilla fighters had genuine sympathizers in communities that felt alienated from Reconstruction-era politics and resented the railroad corporations displacing small farmers. That sympathy was real and shaped the gang's operational environment in concrete ways. But even that sympathy had limits, and the Ford brothers demonstrated exactly where those limits were. The Wild Bunch operated differently, relying on geographic isolation and careful relay systems in open territory rather than community networks. But the same ceiling applied. The environment kept narrowing, the Pinkerton files kept growing, and the informant network kept expanding into every place the gang needed for shelter and supplies. The last serious era of horse-mounted train robbery in the American West ran from approximately 1866 through somewhere around 1912. By the final years of that period, the operational environment had changed enough that the basic mechanics of the crime had become nearly impossible to execute profitably. Double-tracked main lines ran under wireless telegraphy coverage. The detective infrastructure was mature enough to maintain active files on practically everyone who had ever been associated with a known gang. The federal court system had reached into every territory. The open country that had provided natural refuge had been settled enough that a stranger camping in the backcountry with relay horses was a visible and reportable anomaly, rather than an invisible presence. The era ended not because the outlaws ran out of nerve. It ended because the operating environment methodically eliminated every practical advantage they had started with. Go back to that train slowing in the dark, the riders waiting out past the reach of the headlamp, the messenger inside the express car gripping a shotgun he hopes he will not have to use. From where the gang is sitting, this is the moment everything has been built toward. The information, the scouting, the relay horses, the plan for the car, the escape route memorized in daylight, and being ridden now in the dark. From where the railroad is sitting, this is a contingency they have planned for and priced. The telegraph operator at the station 8 miles back noted the time the train passed. He will note when it fails to reach the next station on schedule. The window in which nothing has happened yet is already closing. The messenger in the car knows his job. The safe is bolted to the floor. Somewhere in the territory, a man with a Pinkerton retainer keeps a file with names and faces, and a map with circles drawn around the places those names have been known to operate. The robbery itself takes 20 minutes. The response to it takes years. And the response is better funded, better organized, better connected, and more patient than any gang that ever stopped a train in open country. That is what the American West actually was in those decades. Not a place where bold men operated freely beyond the reach of consequence. A place where the machinery of consequence was being built, piece by piece, telegraph wire by telegraph wire, reward poster by reward poster, court record by court record. The outlaws did not lose because they were cowards or fools. They lost because they were operating against a system that got better faster than they did, in a country that was getting smaller every year.